We are back in Calvin's Tormentors by Gary W. Jenkins, and we're now at chapter 7, which is the scholarly tormentor, François Baudouin, who was an opportunist, Irenicist, and Calvin's judicial mirror. According to Jenkins, among the figures who opposed John Calvin, either by slander, polemic, or institutional sabotage, he would say few were intellectually as sophisticated or as maddeningly elusive as François Baudouin. In chapter 7, Jenkins writes, quote, Baudouin remains the most enigmatic of Calvin's tormentors, unquote. Baudouin did not pen vitriolic screeds against Geneva. He did not organize an anti-Calvinist party. His torment was more subtle and perhaps more dangerous. He embodied the kind of Renaissance intellectualism that Calvin mistrusted most, and he refused to stay put in the confessional lines that Calvin saw as essential to the truth of the gospel. Chapter 7 doesn't just recount the theological disagreements that eventually arose between the two, but it examines what happens when two former law students like Calvin and Baudouin emerge from the same intellectual furnace but set their moral compass in opposite directions. Section 1, Parallel Lives, Calvin and Baudouin's Juridical Foundations. François Baudouin was born in 1520 in Arras, in French Picardy, just 11 years after Calvin was born in Noyon, which is also in Picardy. Both came of age within the intellectual ferment of early French humanism, and they were both trained in Roman law, one of the most rigorous and influential disciplines of that day. And as Jenkins notes, quote, Baudouin, a Picardy by birth, like Calvin, had studied law in Orleans and Bourges, as well connected to the humanist legal circles of France. Their early training placed them in the same orbit. Orleans and Bourges were legal powerhouses of Renaissance Europe. The law was not simply a profession, but it was a method of thought. It was analytical, textual, and inherently adversarial. But the comparison ends at their formation. Calvin would turn his legal acumen into theological framework of precise ecclesiastical discipline and confessional clarity. Calvin didn't finish his legal education. Baudouin did go ahead and completed his. Baudouin, by contrast, developed his legal talents into a career of political diplomacy, textual annotation, and ultimately confessional ambiguity, according to Jenkins. Jenkins writes, quote, if Calvin forged the discipline of Geneva out of law and theology, Baudouin turned law into a tool of courtly and ecclesiastical advancement, unquote. The contrast being made here between the two men is instructive, both viewed through a legal lens, but where Calvin saw the necessity of God's judgment and covenant order, Baudouin saw an opportunity for conciliation, maneuver, and patronage. Section 2, Reformer, Reconciler, or Careerist. Baudouin's early association with the Protestant cause was seemingly genuine, according to Jenkins, at least for a time. He participated in Reformed colloquies, associated with Protestant scholars, and even held positions in Protestant regions. Jenkins writes, quote, he had moved within the orbit of Protestant reformers, having taught in Strasbourg and associated with men like Melanchthon, unquote. So he wasn't a marginal figure. He was respected for his knowledge of civil and canon law, but Calvin, ever sensitive to character, became wary. Quote, by 1544, Calvin had already taken measure of Baudouin and found him wanting, unquote. Why? Jenkins writes, quote, Baudouin had all the learning one could desire, but Calvin saw him as one of those vain men whose sole aim in life was the procurement of position and prestige, unquote. And Calvin had a close hand familiarity of Baudouin. Baudouin at some point lived with Calvin, and at some point was Calvin's secretary for a few years. Calvin certainly had very close proximity and familiarity with Baudouin. So Jenkins writes, this is not a minor theological disagreement. It was more of a moral and vocational rift. Calvin increasingly viewed Baudouin not just as mistaken, but as morally compromised, someone who, quote, moved from court to court, always in search of favor, always ready to adjust his confession to his surroundings, unquote. This adaptability, lauded in courtly circles, was repellent to Calvin, and not only Calvin, who considered doctrinal truth a matter of eternal consequence, not diplomatic utility. You remember from chapter 1, Louis Dutillé, who was noted as an academite, according to Calvin. Baudouin was in the same category. While in France, Baudouin attended the Mass, all the while identifying as a reformer, and he did this for self-preservation. Not saying that's right or wrong, but that led to the label of an academite for him as well. Section 3, that's the break between Calvin and Baudouin. Baudouin's most notorious act in Calvin's eyes was his association with George Cassander, a Catholic theologian and Irenaeist who sought to find common ground between Catholicism and Protestantism. Cassander's, quote, minimal creed approach was an anathema to Calvin, who considered such conciliation a form of doctrinal betrayal. Jenkins writes, quote, Baudouin had cast his lot with Cassander's policy of seeking the broadest possible definition of the faith in a position Calvin considered both cowardly and heretical, unquote. Calvin's response was swift and unyielding. He denounced Baudouin publicly, calling him a sophist and an opportunist. Jenkins writes, quote, for Calvin, the willingness to dilute doctrine for the sake of peace was no virtue. It was a vice that threatened the integrity of the gospel itself, unquote. This is where the torment took from. Baudouin had once seemed a possible ally, and a brilliant one at that, a fellow legal mind who could have bolstered the Reformed cause with scholarly rigor, but in Calvin's view, he had sold his gifts for favor and not for faithfulness. Section 4, a mind for counsels and codes, Baudouin the scholar. To judge Baudouin only by his theology, however, would miss this broader picture. Jenkins gives him a full credit for his broad and immense scholarly production, especially in ecclesiastical and legal history. Quote, he was among the first to produce a critical edition of the Acts of the Councils, and his legal annotations were widely respected in both confessions, unquote. Interestingly enough, if you recall, Calvin's first published writing was a commentary on Seneca's De Clementia, or on mercy, and Baudouin's first book was a commentary on agricultural, or summary of agricultural law under the Emperor Justinian. Interesting. But in regard to the critical edition of the Acts of the Councils that Baudouin wrote, Jenkins says this was not a fringe work. It was used by Catholics and Protestants alike. He also worked, Baudouin, on patristic texts, editing sources critical to both doctrinal and canonical debates. Jenkins acknowledges, quote, his learning was never in doubt. It was just his loyalty, unquote, which makes Baudouin more dangerous in Calvin's eyes than most of the other outspoken Catholic opponents. Calvin could fight Rome, he could expose heresy, but Baudouin was a moving target, cloaked in erudition, always able to claim neutrality, and always able to plead for peace. Maybe you know someone like this today. Section 5, Baudouin versus Doutraine, two tormentors compared. Here Jenkins provides comparative insight between Louis Doutraine, the crude monk turned polemicist, was Calvin's opposite in terms of learning and subtlety. Jenkins describes Doutraine's approach as, quote, combative, polemical, and rooted in a defensive Catholicism that saw Calvin as a monster of heresy, unquote. Doutraine tormented Calvin by slandering his doctrine and attacking the Church of Geneva in print. But Baudouin's torment came through intellectual subversion. Quote, where Doutraine erred from simplicity and ignorance, Baudouin erred from calculation and duplicity, unquote. Calvin could refute Doutraine, but Baudouin undermined the very idea that truth needed to be defended. He turned the Reformation into a negotiation, which for Calvin was was a worse betrayal than just open warfare, as experienced with Dutrain. Section 6, the final irony and a life without home. Baudouin ended his days in relative obscurity. Though widely read in his lifetime, he died more or less without a party. His attempts at irenic mediation were ultimately distrusted by both sides. Interestingly enough, on Project Gutenberg, you can find some of his writings and his correspondence, to include correspondence with Calvin. But Jenkins here in this chapter writes, quote, Baudouin is difficult to categorize precisely because he never held to any confession long enough to be identified with it, unquote. His life was a study in missed possibilities. He had immense gifts, stunning erudition, but no anchor. Jenkins does not deny his influence, but he underlies the tragic waste. Quote, Baudouin was brilliant, he was learned, and utterly unmoored, unquote. Calvin's judgment, harsh as it may seem, was rooted in this: a man who had every faculty to serve the truth, but used them to serve himself. Quote, in the end, he reminds us that the Reformation was not only a war of doctrines, but a war of integrities. At the very beginning of this chapter, there's a quote of Baudouin's, which reads, and in this quote, he's addressing Calvin. It goes, quote, and behold, Calvin's notorious pamphlet appeared in French, besotted with an atrocious yammering, for he employs the marvelously eloquent language for cursing, and not as a witty, buffoonish rake, but adorned with the repetitions one gets from the decorous dives of a raucous, obscene brothel keeper, and at the same time armed with bolts of anathemas, that by reason of such strength he can conquer with a single hiss, for this is his art of choice when treating with others, unquote. François Baudouin, professor, diplomat, editor, jurist, was not Calvin's most aggressive enemy, but he may have been the most troubling. Why? Because he looked like Calvin, he studied like Calvin, he lived with Calvin, he rose up like Calvin, but when it came time to confess, he hesitated, and then he negotiated, and then he floated. To Calvin, that was not scholarship, it was betrayal. And so, while Baudouin passed through courts and councils with learned acclaim, Calvin dismissed him with a single word: sophist. And that's chapter 7, François Baudouin, and we will continue next time with the remaining chapters we have of this book.